On a warm summer day in June 1928, a baby boy was born in the city of Rosario, Argentina. His parents had no idea that this child would one day become one of the most famous revolutionaries in the world. They named him Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, but the world would later know him simply as Che. The Guevara family lived a comfortable life in middle-class Argentina. Ernesto's father worked as a civil engineer and owned some land where he grew crops. His mother came from a wealthy family that had lived in Argentina for many generations. The family had enough money to live well, with a nice house, good food, and servants to help with daily tasks. Young Ernesto was the oldest of 5 children. From the very beginning, he was different from other children his age. He had wild, curly hair that never seemed to stay neat, and bright eyes that always seemed to be watching and learning. His parents noticed that he was very smart and curious about everything around him. But Ernesto faced a big challenge from early childhood. When he was just 2 years old, he developed a serious illness called asthma. This disease made it very hard for him to breathe, especially when he tried to run or play like other children. Many nights, his parents would wake up to hear him struggling to get enough air into his lungs. Most children with such a serious breathing problem might have become quiet and careful, but not Ernesto. Instead of letting his asthma stop him, he seemed to fight against it with all his strength. He refused to stay inside when other children were playing outside. He insisted on trying every sport and activity, even when it made him cough and wheeze. His mother, Celia, was especially important in shaping young Ernesto's character. She was a strong woman who believed that people should fight for what is right. She taught her son that being sick was no excuse for giving up. When Ernesto had trouble breathing, she would encourage him to keep trying. She would tell him that the mind could overcome the body's weakness if a person was brave enough. The Guevara house was always full of interesting conversations. Ernesto's parents often invited friends over to discuss politics, books, and ideas about how society should work. Even as a small child, Ernesto would listen carefully to these grown-up conversations. He heard his parents and their friends talking about poor people who didn't have enough food, workers who were treated badly by their bosses, and countries where rich people had everything while others had nothing. These dinner table discussions planted important seeds in young Ernesto's mind. He began to notice things around him that he had never paid attention to before. When the family drove through different parts of the city, he would see children his own age who looked hungry and wore torn clothes. He would ask his parents why some people lived in big houses while others lived in tiny shacks. Ernesto's mother was particularly interested in helping women gain more rights in society. In those days, women in Argentina could not vote and had very few legal rights. Celia believed this was wrong and often spoke about it at home. She taught Ernesto that all people, whether men or women, rich or poor, should be treated fairly. This lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life. School was easy for Ernesto because he was naturally very intelligent. He loved to read books about history, adventure, and faraway places. While other children played with toys, Ernesto would often be found reading thick books meant for adults. He was especially interested in stories about brave people who fought against unfair rulers or helped poor people. His favorite books were about explorers and adventurers. He read about men who traveled to unknown lands, discovered new places, and had exciting experiences. These stories filled his imagination with dreams of his own adventures. He would often tell his family that someday he would travel to distant countries and see the world for himself. Despite his love of reading and learning, Ernesto was not a quiet bookworm. He had a strong personality and was not afraid to speak his mind. If he disagreed with something, he would say so, even if it made adults uncomfortable. His teachers sometimes found him challenging because he would question things that other students simply accepted. As Ernesto grew older, his asthma attacks continued to be a serious problem. There were times when his breathing became so difficult that his parents worried he might die. But each time he recovered, he seemed to become even more determined to live life fully. It was as if facing death made him appreciate life more and want to make the most of every day. The young boy developed a reputation for being fearless. He would climb the highest trees even when his breathing was bad. He would join in rough games with older children, refusing to quit even when he was clearly struggling. His friends and family began to see that Ernesto had an unusual amount of willpower and courage. By the time he was a teenager, Ernesto had grown into a tall, thin young man with intense eyes and a serious expression. His asthma was still a constant companion, but he had learned to manage it better. More importantly, he had developed a strong character and firm beliefs that would guide him through the rest of his life. The comfortable world of the Guevara family had given Ernesto many advantages. He had received a good education, learned to think critically, and developed a strong sense of right and wrong. But it had also shown him that the world was full of inequality and injustice. The seeds planted by his parents' political discussions and his own observations of society were beginning to grow. As Ernesto prepared to leave childhood behind and enter the adult world, he carried with him several important qualities. He had learned to be brave in the face of physical challenges. He had developed a questioning mind that would not simply accept what he was told. Most importantly, he had begun to believe that people had a duty to help others who were suffering or being treated unfairly. The comfortable young man from Argentina did not yet know that he would become a revolutionary, but the foundations were already in place. His childhood struggles with asthma had taught him to never give up. His family's political discussions had opened his eyes to injustice. His love of adventure books had filled him with dreams of seeing the world. All of these elements would soon combine to transform Ernesto Guevara from a privileged Argentine medical student into Che Guevara, one of history's most famous revolutionaries. But that transformation was still years away. For now, he was simply a young man getting ready to leave home and discover what the world had to offer. By 1951, Ernesto Guevara had grown into a 23-year-old medical student at the University of Buenos Aires. He was tall and lean, with messy dark hair and serious eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His asthma still bothered him, but he had learned to live with the constant struggle to breathe. What bothered him more was the feeling that his comfortable life in Argentina was keeping him from understanding the real world. Ernesto had always dreamed of adventure and travel. The books he read as a child had filled his mind with images of distant lands and unknown peoples. Now, as a young man studying to become a doctor, he felt trapped by routine and textbooks. He wanted to see South America with his own eyes, not just read about it in medical journals and geography books. His friend Alberto Granado shared this hunger for adventure. Alberto was older than Ernesto and worked as a biochemist, but he too felt that life was passing him by. The two young men spent many evenings talking about their dreams of exploring the continent that stretched beyond Argentina's borders. They wondered what life was like in the mountains of Peru, the jungles of Colombia, and the beaches of Venezuela. One day Alberto came to Ernesto with an exciting proposal. He had an old motorcycle that he thought could carry them across South America. The bike was not in perfect condition, but Alberto believed it could make the journey if they were careful. Ernesto was immediately interested. Here was a chance to turn their dreams into reality. The motorcycle was a Norton 500 that had seen better days. Its engine made strange noises, the brakes were unreliable, and the whole machine shook when it reached high speeds. But to Ernesto and Alberto, it represented freedom and adventure. They gave it the nickname La Poderosa, which means the mighty one in Spanish. The name was partly a joke since the bike was anything but mighty, but it also showed their hope that it would carry them safely on their great adventure. Preparing for the journey took months of planning. They had to save money for gasoline, food, and emergency repairs. They studied maps and decided on a route that would take them through Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. Most importantly, they had to convince their families that this crazy idea was worth the risk. Ernesto's parents were worried about his health. They knew that his asthma could become dangerous if he got sick far from home. They also wondered if the old motorcycle would break down in some remote place where they could not get help. But they had raised their son to be independent and brave, so they eventually gave him their blessing. On January 4, 1952, Ernesto and Alberto climbed onto La Poderosa and began their journey. They had no idea that this trip would change Ernesto's life forever. They thought they were simply two young men looking for adventure before settling down to serious careers. The first part of the journey took them south through Argentina toward Chile. The motorcycle performed better than expected, and the two friends enjoyed the freedom of the open road. They camped under the stars, met friendly people in small towns, and felt like they were living the adventure they had always dreamed about. But as they traveled further from home, Ernesto began to see things that troubled him deeply. In the countryside, he met farm workers who lived in terrible poverty. These people worked hard every day but could barely feed their families. Their houses were small and dirty, without electricity or running water. Many of the children looked sick and hungry. In the cities, things were even worse in some ways. Ernesto saw entire families living in one small room in crowded slums. He visited hospitals where poor people could not afford medical treatment and had to suffer in silence. As a medical student, he was especially upset to see people dying from diseases that could easily be cured if they had money for medicine. One of the most powerful experiences came when they visited a copper mine in Chile. Ernesto met workers who spent their days deep underground, breathing poisonous dust and working in dangerous conditions. Many of them had lung diseases that made breathing as difficult for them as Ernesto Hesesma made it for him. But unlike Ernesto, who had a comfortable home and family to support him, these workers had no choice but to keep working until their bodies gave out. The workers told Ernesto stories that made him angry and sad. They explained how foreign companies owned the mines and took most of the profits back to their own countries. The Chilean workers did all the dangerous work but received very little money in return. When workers tried to organize for better conditions, they were often fired or even arrested. As the journey continued, La Poderosa began to have more serious problems. The engine broke down frequently, and they had to push the heavy motorcycle up steep mountain roads. Finally, in Chile, the bike died completely. But instead of ending their journey, Ernesto and Alberto decided to continue on foot, by hitchhiking, and on boats. This decision turned out to be very important. Without the motorcycle, they had to rely on the kindness of ordinary people for rides and places to sleep. This brought them into closer contact with the poor and working people of South America. They stayed in the homes of miners, farmers, and laborers. They shared simple meals and heard countless stories of hardship and struggle. In Peru, Ernesto had an experience that he would remember for the rest of his life. They visited a leper colony where people with leprosy lived apart from the rest of society. Leprosy was a disease that ate away at people's skin and limbs, making them look frightening to others. Most visitors to the colony were afraid to get too close to the patients, but Ernesto was different. As a medical student, he understood that leprosy was not as contagious as people believed. More importantly, he saw that the patients were human beings who deserved respect and kindness. On his 24th birthday, which he celebrated at the colony, Ernesto decided to swim across a river to spend the evening with the patients who lived on the other side. This swim became a symbol of something important happening inside Ernesto. He was crossing more than just a river. He was crossing from his old life of comfort and privilege to a new understanding of the world. He was beginning to identify with the poor, the sick, and the outcast rather than with people like his own family. The journey continued through Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. Everywhere they went, Ernesto saw the same patterns. A few rich people owned most of the land and businesses, while the majority of people lived in poverty. Foreign companies took natural resources out of South American countries without giving much back to the local people. Governments seemed more interested in helping the wealthy than in solving the problems of ordinary citizens. By the time Ernesto returned to Argentina in July 1952, he was a changed person. The comfortable medical student who had left home 6 months earlier had been replaced by a young man with a burning sense of injustice. He had seen too much suffering to ever again be satisfied with a quiet, comfortable life. The motorcycle journey had awakened something powerful in Ernesto Guevara. He now understood that the poverty and suffering he had witnessed were not accidents or natural disasters. They were the result of systems that kept some people rich while others remained poor. This realization would drive him to spend the rest of his life fighting for change. The adventure that had begun as a young man's search for excitement had become something much more important. It had opened Ernesto's eyes to the real conditions of life in South America and planted the seeds of revolutionary thinking that would soon transform him into Che Guevara. When Ernesto Guevara returned to Argentina from his motorcycle journey in 1952, he was no longer the same person who had left months earlier. The comfortable medical student had seen too much poverty and suffering to continue living as if nothing had changed. He finished his medical degree in 1953, but his heart was no longer focused on becoming a traditional doctor. The world beyond Argentina was calling to him again. This time, Ernesto decided to travel alone. He wanted to understand more about the political forces that created the inequality he had witnessed during his first journey. His destination was Guatemala, a small Central American country where something very interesting was happening. A president named Jacobo Arbenz was trying to help poor farmers by giving them land that had been taken from them by foreign companies. The journey to Guatemala took Ernesto through Bolivia, where he witnessed the aftermath of a revolution that had happened in 1952. The Bolivian people had overthrown their government and were trying to create a more fair society. Ernesto was fascinated by what he saw. Here was proof that ordinary people could change their lives if they were willing to fight for it. When Ernesto finally reached Guatemala, he found a country full of hope and excitement. President Arbenz was taking land away from the United Fruit Company, a powerful American business, and giving it to Guatemalan farmers who had nothing. For the first time in their lives, these farmers could grow food for their own families. Instead of working for foreign bosses who paid them almost nothing, Ernesto was amazed by what he saw in Guatemala. Here was a government that actually cared about poor people. He met many other young Latin Americans who had come to Guatemala because they believed it was showing the way forward for all of their countries. They spent long nights discussing politics, revolution, and dreams of a better future. But Ernesto also learned that powerful forces were working against Guatemala. The United Fruit Company was angry about losing its land. The American government was worried that Guatemala's example might spread to other countries. They began to plan ways to stop what was happening in Guatemala. In 1954, Ernesto's education about the real world took a dark turn. The American Central Intelligence Agency helped organize a group of Guatemalan soldiers to overthrow President Arbenz. The CIA provided weapons, money, and training to these rebels. They also used radio stations to spread fear and confusion among the Guatemalan people. Ernesto watched in horror as everything good that was happening in Guatemala was destroyed. The new government that took power canceled all of Arbenz's reforms. The land was given back to the United Fruit Company. The farmers who had briefly tasted freedom were forced back into poverty. Many people who had supported Arbenz were arrested, tortured, or killed. This experience taught Ernesto a lesson that would stay with him forever. He learned that powerful countries like the United States would not allow poor countries to improve their lives if it threatened American business interests. He realized that creating a fair society would require more than good intentions. It would require the willingness to fight against very powerful enemies. Fearing for his safety as a foreigner who had supported Arbenz, Ernesto fled to Mexico City. He arrived there as a changed man. The idealistic young traveler was becoming a hardened revolutionary. He had seen that the choice was not between violence and peace, but between the violence of oppression and the violence of liberation. In Mexico City, Ernesto met other Latin American exiles who had fled from dictatorships in their own countries. Many of them were communists who believed that only a complete change of the economic system could solve the problems of Latin America. Ernesto began to read the writings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. He found that their ideas about class struggle and revolution made sense of everything he had experienced. It was during this time that Ernesto acquired the nickname that would make him famous around the world. Argentines have a habit of using the word che in their speech, similar to how Americans might say hey or buddy. Because Ernesto used this word so often, his new friends in Mexico began calling him Che. At first it was just a friendly nickname, but it would soon become the name by which the whole world knew him. In July 1955, fate brought Che to a meeting that would change his life and the history of Latin America. At a small gathering in Mexico City, he was introduced to a young Cuban lawyer named Fidel Castro. Castro had recently been released from prison in Cuba, where he had been held for trying to overthrow the dictator Fulgencio Batista. The meeting between Che and Fidel lasted all night. Castro spoke passionately about his plans to return to Cuba and free his country from Batista's dictatorship. He described the corruption and brutality of the Cuban government and his vision of a Cuba where all people would have enough to eat, where children could go to school, and where foreign companies could not exploit Cuban workers. Che was impressed by Castro's intelligence and dedication. Here was someone who was not just talking about revolution, but actually planning to do something about it. Castro, for his part, was struck by Che's experience and his deep understanding of Latin American problems. By the end of their conversation, Che had volunteered to join Castro's planned invasion of Cuba. This decision was remarkable for several reasons. Che had no military experience beyond reading books about guerrilla warfare. His asthma made him physically weak compared to most soldiers. Most importantly, Cuba was not his country. He was an Argentine who had never even visited Cuba. But Che believed that the struggle for justice had no borders. As he would later write, the duty of every revolutionary is to make revolution wherever it is needed. Castro was initially doubtful about accepting this sickly Argentine doctor into his movement. But as he got to know Che better, he realized that this was an extraordinary person. Che's intelligence, his selfless dedication, and his willingness to sacrifice everything for the cause convinced Castro that he would be a valuable addition to the revolutionary group. Che made it clear from the beginning that he wanted to do more than serve as the expedition's doctor. He intended to fight as a soldier and eventually as a commander if he proved himself capable. This ambition might have seemed ridiculous for someone with no military training, but Che had already shown throughout his life that he could overcome any obstacle through determination and hard work. The period of training and preparation in Mexico was dangerous and difficult. The Cuban exiles had to avoid detection by Mexican police, Cuban spies, and American agents who all wanted to stop their mission. Che used this time to study military tactics and to help plan the invasion strategy. More importantly, this period allowed Che to complete his transformation from Ernesto Guevara, the Argentine medical student, to Che Guevara, the international revolutionary. He had found his true calling at last. The comfortable life his family had planned for him was now completely abandoned. He was ready to risk everything for the chance to create a better world. By late 1956, the preparations were complete. Che and 81 other men were ready to sail to Cuba and begin what seemed like an impossible mission. They had little money, few weapons, and no guarantee that the Cuban people would support them. But they had something more powerful than money or weapons. They had a dream of justice and the courage to fight for it. The young man who had once dreamed of adventure while reading books in his comfortable Argentine home was about to embark on the greatest adventure of all. He was going to try to overthrow a government and create a revolution that would change not just Cuba, but the entire world. On November 25, 1956, an old yacht called the Grandma left the coast of Mexico carrying 82 men who believed they could change the world. Among them was Che Guevara, the Argentine doctor who had given up everything to join Fidel Castro's impossible dream of freeing Cuba from dictatorship. The boat was crowded and uncomfortable, and most of the men were seasick during the rough journey across the Gulf of Mexico. Che had never been in a real battle before. His only experience with fighting came from books about military strategy that he had read during their training in Mexico. But he carried with him something more valuable than experience. He had an unshakable belief that their cause was right and that ordinary people deserved to live with dignity and freedom. The invasion was a disaster from the very beginning. The Grandma was supposed to land secretly on a remote beach in eastern Cuba, but everything went wrong. The boat arrived 2 days late because of bad weather and engine problems. When they finally reached the Cuban coast, they landed in the wrong place, in a swamp instead of on a beach. Even worse, the dictator Batista's soldiers were waiting for them. Someone had warned the government about the invasion, and troops were positioned all along the coast. As soon as the revolutionaries stepped onto Cuban soil, they came under heavy gunfire. The men scattered in panic, running in different directions through the swamp and into the nearby forest. For Che, this was his baptism of fire. He had never heard bullets flying past his head before, never seen men falling wounded and dying around him. His medical training told him to help the injured, but his survival instincts told him to find cover and stay alive. In those first terrifying moments, he learned what war really meant. Within 3 days, most of Castro's army was dead or captured. The survivors were scattered across the countryside, hungry, lost, and hunted by Batista's troops. Che found himself alone in the forest with just a few other men, including Fidel Castro and his brother Raúl. They had no food, little ammunition, and no idea if any of their comrades had survived. During those desperate first days, Che faced a moment that would define the rest of his life. As they fled through the forest, he found himself carrying both his medical kit and a box of ammunition. The two items were too heavy to carry together, and enemy soldiers were getting closer. He had to choose between his role as a doctor and his role as a revolutionary fighter. Without hesitation, Che dropped the medical kit and kept the ammunition. In that moment, he stopped being Dr. Ernesto Guevara and became Comandante Che Guevara. He had chosen to be a warrior for justice rather than just a healer. From that day forward, he would think of himself as a soldier first, even though he continued to treat wounded comrades whenever possible. The survivors slowly found each other in the mountains of eastern Cuba called the Sierra Maestra. These mountains were perfect for guerrilla warfare. They were covered with thick forests, had many caves for hiding, and were far from the main roads where Batista's army could easily travel. The local farmers knew every path and hiding place, and many of them hated Batista's government. At first, the Revolutionary Army consisted of fewer than 20 men. They had almost no weapons, very little food, and no contact with the outside world. Many people would have given up, but Che discovered that he had a talent for this kind of warfare. Despite having no military training, he seemed to understand instinctively how to fight a guerrilla war. Che quickly became one of Castro's most trusted commanders. He was brave in battle, smart in planning attacks, and completely dedicated to the cause. He never asked for special treatment because of his asthma, even when the mountain air made it hard for him to breathe. He shared the same dangers and hardships as the common soldiers, which earned him their respect and loyalty. More than just a fighter, Che became the conscience of the Revolutionary Army. He insisted that the guerrillas treat prisoners humanely and respect the property of poor farmers. He established rules that forbade his men from stealing, drinking alcohol, or abusing civilians. He wanted to show the Cuban people that this revolution was different from previous ones. Che also became the revolution's teacher and organizer. Many of the men who joined their army could not read or write. Che set up schools in their mountain camps where soldiers could learn basic reading and mathematics. He started a newspaper called El Cubano Libre to spread news about their victories and to explain their goals to the Cuban people. As the months passed, more and more Cubans joined the Revolutionary Army. Farmers brought food and information about enemy troop movements. Young men came to the mountains to fight against Batista. Women served as nurses, messengers, and sometimes as fighters. Che played a crucial role in organizing these new recruits and turning them into effective soldiers. Che's military genius began to show itself in the battles they fought. He developed new tactics for attacking enemy positions and then disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. He learned how to use the mountains and forests to his advantage, making a small force seem much larger than it really was. His men began to win victories against much larger enemy forces. One of Che's most important innovations was the way he treated captured enemy soldiers. Instead of killing them or holding them prisoner, he would lecture them about the goals of the revolution and then release them. Many of these soldiers went back to their units and told other government troops that the revolutionaries were not the criminals that Batista's propaganda claimed they were. Life in the Sierra Maestra was incredibly hard. The men often went days without proper food, sleeping on the ground in rain and cold. They had to carry all their supplies on their backs as they moved from camp to camp. Che's asthma made these conditions even more difficult for him, but he never complained or asked for easier duties. Despite the hardships, Che later wrote that this was one of the happiest times of his life. He felt that he was finally doing what he was born to do. Every day brought new challenges and the possibility of death, but it also brought the chance to strike a blow against injustice. He was fighting for something larger than himself, and that gave meaning to all the suffering. As 1957 turned into 1958, the Revolutionary Army grew stronger while Batista's government grew weaker. Che was promoted to the rank of comandante, one of the highest positions in the rebel army. He was given command of his own column of fighters and began planning independent operations. The shy medical student who had once struggled to breathe while climbing stairs was now a feared military commander leading hundreds of men into battle. The comfortable middle-class Argentine had become a hardened guerrilla fighter who slept on the ground and ate whatever food he could find. But most importantly, the young man who had once been troubled by the poverty he saw during his motorcycle journey was now actively fighting to create a world where such poverty would not exist. The mountains of Cuba had forged Che Guevara into the revolutionary leader he was meant to become. By late 1958, Che was ready for his greatest military challenge. Castro gave him orders to lead his column out of the Sierra Maestra and capture the city of Santa Clara, a strategic location in central Cuba. If he could take this city, it would cut Cuba in half and make it impossible for Batista to hold on to power. The battle for Santa Clara would prove that the Argentine doctor had truly become one of the most effective military commanders of his generation. The man who had once dropped his medical kit to pick up ammunition was about to show the world what he could accomplish when fighting for justice. On January 1, 1959, the dictator Fulgencio Batista fled Cuba in the middle of the night, taking with him millions of dollars stolen from the Cuban people. When the sun rose that morning, Cuba was free for the first time in many years. Che Guevara, the Argentine doctor who had joined Castro's revolution, found himself in a position he had never imagined. He was no longer a guerrilla fighter hiding in the mountains. He was now one of the leaders of a new government with the power to change an entire country. The victory celebrations in Havana were incredible. Hundreds of thousands of people filled the streets, cheering and crying with joy. Many had family members who had been killed or tortured by Batista's police. Others had lived in fear for years, afraid to speak against the government. Now they were free to express their happiness and hope for the future. Che rode into Havana wearing his dirty guerrilla uniform, his hair long and his beard unkempt from months in the mountains. The people loved his simple appearance because it showed he was not like the wealthy politicians who had ruled Cuba before. He looked like one of them, someone who understood their struggles and shared their dreams. But Che quickly learned that winning a revolution was much easier than running a country. In the mountains, his enemies had been clear and his goals simple. Now he faced complex problems that had no easy solutions. Cuba was a poor country where most people could not read, had no jobs, and lived in terrible conditions. Changing this would require more than good intentions. Castro gave Che one of the most difficult jobs in the new government. He was put in charge of La Cabana Fortress, an old prison where many of Batista's supporters were being held. Che had to decide what to do with hundreds of people who had worked for the old government, including soldiers, police officers, and secret agents who had tortured and killed Cuban revolutionaries. This was a terrible responsibility for someone who had become a revolutionary to help people, not to hurt them. But Che believed that justice required punishment for those who had committed crimes against the Cuban people. He organized trials for the most serious cases, including people who had murdered innocent civilians or tortured prisoners. Many of these trials ended with death sentences. Che personally signed the orders for hundreds of executions. He believed this was necessary to prevent the former government supporters from organizing a counter-revolution. He also thought it would show the Cuban people that the new government was serious about punishing those who had oppressed them. This period at La Cabana was one of the most controversial parts of Che's life. His supporters argued that he was bringing justice to people who had escaped punishment for terrible crimes. His critics said he was acting like a dictator, killing people without proper legal procedures. The truth was probably somewhere in between, but there was no doubt that Che was willing to use violence when he thought it was necessary. While dealing with these difficult decisions, Che was also given another important job. Castro appointed him president of the National Bank of Cuba, even though he had no training in economics or banking. The story goes that when Castro asked if anyone in the group was an economist, Che raised his hand because he thought Castro had asked who was a communist. Whether this story is true or not, it shows how the new Cuban government was making up things as they went along. They had spent years planning how to win the revolution, but they had not spent much time planning how to run the country afterward. Che found himself responsible for Cuba's entire financial system without really knowing how banks worked. As president of the National Bank, Che made decisions that shocked the traditional business world. He signed the new Cuban money with just his nickname Che instead of his full name, saying that formal signatures were unnecessary in a revolutionary government. More importantly, he began the process of taking control of businesses that had been owned by American companies. For many years, American corporations had owned most of Cuba's important businesses. They controlled the sugar plantations, the telephone company, the electric company, and many other essential services. These companies made huge profits but paid very low wages to Cuban workers. Most of the money they earned was sent back to the United States instead of being used to improve life in Cuba. Che believed that Cuba could never truly be independent as long as foreign companies controlled its economy. He began a program of nationalization, which meant that the Cuban government took over these businesses and ran them for the benefit of the Cuban people instead of for foreign profits. This policy made the United States government very angry. American companies complained that Cuba was stealing their property. The U.S. government began to put pressure on Cuba to return the businesses to their original owners. When Cuba refused, America began an economic blockade that made it very difficult for Cuba to buy and sell goods with other countries. Che was not surprised by this reaction. His experience in Guatemala had taught him that the United States would never allow Latin American countries to control their own resources if it hurt American business interests. He had expected this conflict and was prepared to fight it. In 1961, Che was promoted again, this time to Minister of Industries. His job was to help Cuba develop its own factories and reduce its dependence on foreign countries for manufactured goods. This was an enormous challenge because Cuba had always been an agricultural country that grew sugar and tobacco but imported almost everything else it needed. Che threw himself into this work with the same energy he had shown as a guerrilla commander. He studied economics textbooks, visited factories, and worked alongside ordinary laborers to understand how production worked. He often spent his weekends doing volunteer work in sugar fields or construction projects, showing that government leaders should not consider themselves too important for manual labor. One of Che's most important ideas during this period was his concept of the new man. He believed that the revolution should not just change Cuba's economic system, but should also change the way people thought about work and society. Instead of working only for money or personal gain, people should work because they wanted to help their community and build a better country. Che tried to put this idea into practice by eliminating piecework payments and bonuses that rewarded individual achievement. Instead, he wanted people to be motivated by moral incentives like recognition for good work and the satisfaction of contributing to society. He believed that if people could be educated to think differently about work, Cuba could build a truly socialist society. This approach had mixed results. Some workers were inspired by Che's vision and worked harder than ever before. Others missed the extra money they could earn through individual effort and became less productive. Che's factories often failed to meet their production targets, leading to shortages of goods that Cuban families needed. Despite these problems, Che remained committed to his ideals. He continued to believe that Cuba could create a new type of society where people cared more about helping each other than about getting rich. He worked 18-hour days trying to make his vision become reality, never taking vacations and rarely spending time with his own family. By the mid-1960s, it was clear that Che's approach to running the economy was not working as well as hoped. Cuba was still poor, still dependent on foreign help, and still struggling to provide its people with basic necessities. Some Cuban leaders began to question whether Che's idealistic approach was practical for governing a real country. Che himself was becoming frustrated with the compromises and bureaucracy that governing required. The man who had once fought with complete freedom in the mountains now found himself trapped behind a desk, dealing with paperwork and meetings instead of direct action against injustice. By the early 1960s, Che Guevara had become much more than just a Cuban revolutionary. He was now one of the most recognizable faces of the global struggle against imperialism and poverty. His wild hair and intense eyes appeared on posters and in newspapers around the world. But Che was not content to be just a symbol. He wanted to use his fame to spread revolution to every corner of the earth where people suffered under oppression. Castro began sending Che on diplomatic missions to represent Cuba in other countries. This was a perfect job for Che because it allowed him to travel and meet with revolutionaries and leaders from around the world. He could share Cuba's experience and learn about the struggles happening in other places. Most importantly, he could try to build a global network of countries and movements that would support each other against American imperialism. Che's first major international trip took him to the Soviet Union in 1960. This was a crucial visit because Cuba desperately needed economic help after the United States had stopped buying Cuban sugar and selling goods to Cuba. The Soviet Union was the world's other superpower, and it claimed to support revolutionary movements everywhere. But Che was not impressed by what he saw in the Soviet Union. The country was powerful and had defeated the Nazis in World War II, but it did not seem to have the revolutionary spirit that Che believed was necessary for true socialism. The Soviet leaders lived comfortable lives while ordinary workers struggled. The government was controlled by bureaucrats who seemed more interested in following rules than in helping people. Most troubling to Che was the Soviet attitude toward revolution in other countries. The Soviet leaders wanted to avoid war with the United States, so they were careful not to support revolutionary movements too openly. They preferred to work slowly through diplomacy and economic pressure rather than helping people fight for their freedom. Che believed this approach was wrong and cowardly. He thought that people everywhere had the right to rebel against unjust governments, and that successful revolutionary countries like Cuba and the Soviet Union had a duty to help them. This disagreement would cause problems for Che throughout his career as a diplomat. From the Soviet Union, Che traveled to other communist countries in Eastern Europe. He visited Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Poland, negotiating trade agreements and studying different approaches to building socialism. Everywhere he went, he found the same problem. These countries had eliminated capitalism, but they had not created the kind of society that Che dreamed of. The people in these countries had jobs and housing, but they did not seem excited about building a better world. They worked because they had to, not because they believed in what they were doing. There was no sense of adventure or possibility, no feeling that they were part of something great and important. To Che, this was not real revolution, but just a different kind of bureaucracy. Che was much more excited by his visits to countries that were fighting for their independence from colonial powers. He traveled to Algeria, where revolutionaries were fighting a bloody war against French rule. He met with Ahmed Ben Bella and other Algerian leaders who reminded him of his own experiences in the Cuban mountains. In Algeria, Che found the revolutionary spirit that was missing in the Soviet Union. The Algerian fighters were willing to sacrifice everything for their cause. They lived simply and fought bravely against a much stronger enemy. They reminded Che of why he had become a revolutionary in the first place. Che also visited other African countries that had recently gained independence from European colonial powers. In Guinea, he met President Kwame Nkrumah, who was trying to unite all of Africa against continued European interference. In Mali, he saw leaders who were attempting to build socialism in one of the world's poorest regions. These visits convinced Che that the real struggle for human freedom was happening in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, not in the comfortable offices of Moscow or Washington. The people in these continents were fighting against the same kinds of oppression that Cubans had faced under Batista, but on a much larger scale. In December 1964, Che was given the honor of representing Cuba at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. This was one of the most important speeches of his life, and he used it to attack American foreign policy and call for worldwide revolution against imperialism. Standing before delegates from every country in the world, Che spoke passionately about the need for poor countries to work together against rich countries that exploited them. He condemned the United States for supporting dictatorships in Latin America and for trying to overthrow governments that threatened American business interests. Che's speech at the United Nations made headlines around the world. His supporters praised him for speaking truth to power and defending the rights of oppressed people everywhere. His enemies attacked him as a dangerous communist who was trying to spread chaos and violence. But the speech also revealed a growing problem in Che's relationship with the Cuban government. While Castro was trying to balance Cuba's relationships with both the Soviet Union and China, Che was making speeches that angered both superpowers. His calls for immediate revolution everywhere made it harder for Cuba to maintain the alliances it needed to survive. After his UN speech, Che continued his travels through Africa and Asia. He visited China and met with Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Communist Revolution. Che was impressed by China's approach to revolution, which seemed more aggressive and idealistic than the Soviet model. The Chinese were willing to support revolutionary movements even if it meant conflict with the United States. They believed that revolution was inevitable and that communist countries should help speed it along. This approach appealed to Che much more than the cautious Soviet strategy. During his travels in Africa, Che began to develop his theory of the tricontinental revolution. He believed that the people of Africa, Asia, and Latin America should unite to fight against imperialism from Europe and North America. If these three continents could coordinate their struggles, they could defeat the wealthy countries that had oppressed them for centuries. Che's ideas were inspiring, but they created serious problems for Cuba. His public criticism of Soviet policies made it harder for Cuba to get the economic aid it desperately needed. His calls for immediate revolution worried leaders in other Latin American countries who feared that Cuba was trying to export its revolution to their territories. By 1965, it was becoming clear that Che's vision of global revolution was not compatible with Cuba's need for stability and security. Castro needed to maintain good relationships with the Soviet Union to protect Cuba from American invasion. He could not afford to have one of his top leaders constantly criticizing Soviet policies and calling for wars of liberation everywhere. Che himself was growing frustrated with the compromises that diplomacy required. He had become a revolutionary to fight against injustice, not to sit in comfortable meeting rooms discussing trade agreements and diplomatic protocols. The man who had once carried a rifle in the Sierra Maestra Mountains was now carrying a briefcase to embassy receptions. The gap between Che's revolutionary ideals and the practical needs of governing was becoming impossible to bridge. Something would have to change, and that change would soon take Che away from Cuba and back to the life of action and danger that he truly loved. In April 1965, Che Guevara suddenly disappeared from public view in Cuba. One day he was giving speeches and attending government meetings, and the next day he was nowhere to be found. The Cuban newspapers stopped mentioning his name. Foreign journalists asked questions, but Cuban officials gave vague answers or changed the subject. Wild rumors began to spread around the world about what had happened to the famous revolutionary. Some people thought Che had been killed in a secret power struggle with Castro. Others believed he was seriously ill or had been imprisoned for disagreeing with government policies. A few suspected he had been sent on a secret mission, but no one knew where or why. The mystery of Che's disappearance became front-page news in newspapers around the world. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than most people guessed. Che had not been killed or imprisoned. Instead, he had made one of the most difficult decisions of his life. He had decided to leave Cuba, the country he had helped liberate, to try to bring revolution to another part of the world. His destination was Africa, specifically the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he believed the conditions were perfect for a successful uprising. Che's decision to leave Cuba reflected his deepest beliefs about the nature of revolution. He had always argued that revolution was not something that should happen in just one country. True revolutionaries had a duty to fight injustice wherever it existed, even if it meant leaving behind the comfortable life they had built for themselves. In a farewell letter to Castro, which would not be made public for many months, Che explained his reasons for leaving. He wrote that he had fulfilled his duty to the Cuban Revolution, but that there were other battles to fight in other places. He could not rest while people in Africa, Asia, and Latin America were still suffering under oppression and poverty. The Congo seemed like the perfect place for Che to continue his revolutionary work. The country was rich in natural resources like copper and diamonds, but most of the people were desperately poor. European companies still controlled most of the valuable mines and plantations, even though Congo had gained independence from Belgium a few years earlier. There was already a rebellion happening in eastern Congo, led by people who wanted to create a more fair society. They had asked Cuba for help, and Che volunteered to lead a secret mission to train and organize the Congolese fighters. He believed that his experience in the Cuban mountains would help him succeed in the African jungle. But from the moment Che arrived in Congo, everything went wrong. The situation was much more complicated than he had expected. Unlike in Cuba, where most people had united against the hated dictator Batista, the Congo was divided into many different groups that fought each other as much as they fought the government. The Congolese rebels that Che was supposed to train and lead were very different from the disciplined Cuban revolutionaries he was used to working with. Many of them seemed more interested in stealing from local villages than in fighting for political change. They often ran away from battles at the first sign of serious resistance from government troops. Che tried to use the same methods that had worked in Cuba, but they did not work in Congo. The guerrilla tactics that had been so effective in the Sierra Maestra Mountains were not suitable for the different terrain and conditions of Central Africa. More importantly, Che discovered that revolutionary enthusiasm could not simply be copied from one place to another. The Cuban Revolution had succeeded because it had grown out of specific Cuban conditions. The people had been united in their hatred of Batista, they had supported the rebels with food and information, and the geography of the mountains had favored guerrilla warfare. None of these advantages existed in Congo. Che found himself trying to lead fighters who did not share his political beliefs and did not trust his judgment. He was a foreigner who did not speak their language or understand their culture. Many of the Congolese rebels saw him as just another white man trying to tell them what to do, like the European colonizers they were fighting against. The military situation quickly became hopeless. Che's forces could not capture and hold any important territory. They could not recruit new fighters from the local population. Worst of all, they could not even work together effectively because of constant disagreements and lack of discipline. Che's own health began to suffer severely in the tropical climate of Congo. His asthma, which had always been a problem, became much worse in the hot, humid air. He caught several tropical diseases that left him weak and sick. For weeks at a time, he could barely get out of bed, let alone lead military operations. The psychological impact of failure was even harder for Che to bear than the physical suffering. Throughout his life, he had been successful at almost everything he attempted. He had completed medical school despite his asthma. He had survived the disaster of the Grandma Landing and become one of Cuba's most effective military commanders. He had learned to run a bank and a government ministry despite having no training for these jobs. But in Congo, nothing he tried seemed to work. His military tactics failed. His attempts to organize and train the rebels failed. His efforts to unite the different groups failed. For a man whose identity was built on revolutionary success, this constant failure was devastating. After 7 months of frustration and defeat, Che was forced to admit that his mission had failed completely. In November 1965, he and the other Cuban volunteers quietly left Congo and returned to Cuba. The revolutionary who had always preached that victory was possible through determination and sacrifice had been defeated by circumstances beyond his control. The failure in Congo was a humbling experience that forced Che to question some of his most basic assumptions about revolution. He had believed that the principles that worked in Cuba could work anywhere if they were applied correctly. He had thought that a small group of dedicated revolutionaries could create revolutionary conditions in any country where people were oppressed. The Congo experience taught him that revolution was much more complicated than he had realized. It was not enough to have the right political ideas and the willingness to fight. Revolution also required specific social and economic conditions that could not be created artificially. After leaving Congo, Che spent several months in Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, recovering his health and thinking about what had gone wrong. During this time, he wrote a brutally honest account of his failed African adventure. Unlike many political leaders who try to hide their mistakes, Che admitted his errors and analyzed what he had learned from them. But the failure in Congo did not destroy Che's belief in revolution. Instead, it seemed to make him more determined to try again. He studied his mistakes and began planning a new revolutionary expedition, this time to a place closer to home where he thought his chances of success would be better. The man who had once been called the most successful guerrilla fighter in the world had learned that success was not guaranteed, even for someone with his experience and dedication, but he was not ready to give up his dream of bringing revolution to all the oppressed people of the world. The failure in Congo was not the end of Che's revolutionary career. It was just a painful lesson that would make him think more carefully about his next attempt to change the world through armed struggle. Despite his devastating failure in Congo, Che Guevara had not given up on his dream of spreading revolution throughout the world. After months of reflection in Prague, he became convinced that he had simply chosen the wrong place for his mission. Africa had been too foreign, too different from his own experience. This time he would return to Latin America, where he understood the culture and spoke the language. Che set his sights on Bolivia, a landlocked country in the heart of South America. On paper, Bolivia seemed perfect for revolution. It was one of the poorest countries in the Americas, with most of the population living in terrible poverty while a small group of wealthy families controlled all the land and resources. The majority of Bolivians were indigenous people who had been oppressed for centuries by governments that served only the interests of white elites. Bolivia also had a history of political instability. The government was weak and unpopular, supported mainly by the military and by wealthy business owners. The army was poorly trained and equipped, nothing like the professional forces that had defeated him in Congo. Che believed that a small group of determined guerrillas could spark a revolution that would spread throughout Bolivia and then to neighboring countries. In November 1966, Che entered Bolivia secretly using false papers that identified him as Raymond Benitez, a Uruguayan businessman. He had disguised his appearance by cutting his famous beard and dyeing his hair. Even his own mother would have had trouble recognizing the man who had once been one of the most photographed faces in the world. Che brought with him a small group of Cuban volunteers who had fought alongside him in the Sierra Maestra. He also recruited several Bolivian communists who supported his plan to establish a guerrilla base in the remote southeastern region of the country. From there, they would gradually expand their area of control until they could challenge the government for power. The strategy Che planned to use was called FOCO theory. This idea, which had been developed from the Cuban experience, suggested that a small group of guerrillas could create revolutionary conditions through their actions. They did not need to wait for the people to become revolutionary on their own. By fighting successfully against government forces, the guerrillas would inspire others to join them and eventually create a mass uprising. But from the very beginning, the Bolivian campaign faced problems that would prove impossible to overcome. The first and most serious problem was that the Bolivian Communist Party, which Che had counted on for support, withdrew its backing. The party leaders disagreed with Che's strategy and were also under pressure from the Soviet Union, which did not want to antagonize the United States by supporting armed revolution in Latin America. Without support from the local Communist Party, Che found it much harder to recruit Bolivian fighters or to get supplies and information. His group remained small and isolated, cut off from the very people they were supposed to be fighting for. The Bolivian peasants in the area where they operated viewed the guerrillas as foreign intruders rather than as liberators. This was perhaps the most crushing disappointment for Che. Throughout his revolutionary career, he had believed that poor people everywhere would naturally support anyone who fought against their oppressors. But the Bolivian peasants were suspicious of these Spanish-speaking outsiders who claimed to be fighting for their freedom. Many of them had never heard of Che Guevara or the Cuban Revolution. The language barrier was a serious problem. Most of the peasants in southeastern Bolivia spoke Quechua or Guarani, indigenous languages that none of the guerrillas understood. Che could speak Spanish perfectly, but this was the language of the people who had oppressed the indigenous population for centuries. To many peasants, the guerrillas sounded like just another group of outsiders trying to use them for their own purposes. Che's health was also deteriorating rapidly. The high altitude of Bolivia made his asthma much worse than it had ever been. He frequently had difficulty breathing during long march through the mountains. His attacks became so severe that sometimes he could barely walk, let alone fight. His famous black beard turned gray, and his once strong body became thin and weak. Despite his physical problems, Che refused to admit that his health was affecting his ability to lead. He pushed himself and his men harder as their situation became more desperate. He continued to believe that willpower and revolutionary dedication could overcome any obstacle, including his own failing body. The Bolivian military proved to be much more effective than Che had expected. Instead of the demoralized peasant conscripts he thought he would face, the guerrillas encountered professional soldiers who had been trained by United States Special Forces. These troops used modern counterinsurgency tactics that had been developed during the Vietnam War. The Bolivian army surrounded the area where Che's group was operating and prevented them from expanding their zone of influence. They cut off supply lines and made it impossible for the guerrillas to recruit new fighters. Most importantly, they turned the local population against the guerrillas by convincing them that these foreign fighters were dangerous communist terrorists. As 1967 progressed, Che's band of revolutionaries grew smaller and weaker. Some fighters deserted and returned to their homes. Others were killed in battles with government troops. The few who remained were constantly hungry, sick, and exhausted from running and hiding in the mountains. Che's diary entries from this period show a man who was increasingly aware that his mission was failing but was determined to fight on regardless of the odds. He wrote about the loneliness of command, the frustration of seeing his dreams collapse, and the physical agony of trying to breathe in the thin mountain air. But he never wrote about giving up or retreating. By October 1967, Che's group had been reduced to fewer than 20 men. They were surrounded by Bolivian troops and had no hope of escape. On October 8th, government soldiers finally caught up with them in a small valley near the village of La Higuera. In the battle that followed, several guerrillas were killed and Che himself was wounded in the leg. When the shooting stopped, Che Guevara was captured alive. The man who had once commanded hundreds of fighters in the Cuban mountains was now a prisoner, wounded and exhausted after 11 months of futile struggle. The Bolivian soldiers who captured him could hardly believe they had caught the famous revolutionary whose picture had appeared on magazine covers around the world. Che was taken to the small schoolhouse in La Higuera, where he spent his last night as a prisoner. Despite his desperate situation, witnesses reported that he remained calm and dignified. He spoke quietly with his captors and even gave medical advice to a wounded soldier. He seemed to accept that his revolutionary career was over and that death was probably inevitable. The next morning, October 9, 1967, Bolivian President René Barrientos gave the order for Che's execution. The decision was made with the approval of the Central Intelligence Agency, which had been helping the Bolivian military hunt for Che. A sergeant named Mario Terán was chosen to carry out the execution. When Terán entered the schoolhouse, Che looked at him calmly and spoke his last words. According to witnesses, he said, "Shoot, coward, you are only going to kill a man." A few moments later, the most famous revolutionary of the 20th century was dead. The man who had dedicated his life to fighting for the poor and oppressed had died in a tiny village in one of the poorest countries in the world. The Argentine doctor who had become a Cuban commander had made his final stand in the mountains of Bolivia, far from home and surrounded by enemies. Che Guevara's revolutionary career was over, but his legend was just beginning. When the news of Che Guevara's death reached the world on October 10, 1967, something remarkable happened. Instead of ending his influence, his death transformed him into something far more powerful than he had ever been while alive. The Argentine doctor who had died in a small Bolivian village was about to become one of the most recognizable faces in human history. The Bolivian military made a crucial mistake when they displayed Che's body to prove he was really dead. They laid his corpse on a table in a hospital in the town of Valle Grande, where photographers took pictures that were published in newspapers around the world. Instead of showing the defeat of a dangerous revolutionary, these photographs created an image that reminded many people of paintings of Jesus Christ after his crucifixion. Che's face in death looked peaceful and noble. His long hair and beard gave him an almost religious appearance. His body showed the marks of his hard life as a guerrilla fighter, but his expression seemed calm and dignified. People who saw these photographs did not see a defeated terrorist as the Bolivian government had hoped. Instead, they saw a martyr who had died fighting for justice and freedom. The transformation of Che from a dead revolutionary into a global icon happened amazingly quickly. Within weeks of his death, his image began appearing on posters, T-shirts, and banners at protest demonstrations around the world. Students in Paris carried his picture during the riots of 1968. Civil rights activists in the United States used his image as a symbol of resistance against oppression. The photograph that became most famous was not one of the death pictures from Bolivia. Instead, it was a picture taken by Cuban photographer Alberto Corda in 1960, showing Che looking into the distance with an expression of determination and hope. This image, which showed Che alive and strong, became one of the most reproduced photographs in history. The spread of Che's image was helped by the fact that he had never asked for payment when people used his picture. Unlike most famous people who control how their image is used, Che had always believed that revolutionary symbols should belong to everyone. This meant that anyone could put his face on a poster, a book cover, or a piece of clothing without having to pay for permission. But Che's legacy involved much more than just his famous photograph. His writings about guerrilla warfare became textbooks for revolutionary movements around the world. His ideas about creating a new type of society inspired people who were fighting against injustice in their own countries. His example of sacrificing a comfortable life for the cause of helping others influenced countless young people to become activists. In Latin America, Che became a hero for people who still lived in poverty and oppression. His story proved that it was possible for ordinary people to fight against powerful enemies and win. Even though his final mission in Bolivia had failed, his success in Cuba showed that revolution was not impossible if people were willing to sacrifice everything for their beliefs. Revolutionary groups in many countries tried to copy Che's guerrilla warfare tactics. Some succeeded in overthrowing governments or forcing political changes. Others failed and were destroyed by government forces. But whether they succeeded or failed, most of these groups looked to Che as their inspiration and model. In Cuba, Che was officially declared a hero of the revolution. His image appeared in schools, hospitals, and government buildings throughout the island. Children were taught to admire his selfless dedication and his willingness to help people in other countries, even when it meant leaving his own family behind. The Cuban government carefully protected his reputation as the perfect revolutionary who never thought about personal gain. The search for Che's remains became an important mission for the Cuban government. After his execution, the Bolivian military had buried his body in a secret location to prevent his grave from becoming a place where his supporters could gather. For 30 years, no one knew where Che was buried. Finally, in 1997, his bones were found and returned to Cuba, where they were placed in a beautiful mausoleum in the city of Santa Clara. The mausoleum became a place of pilgrimage for people from around the world who wanted to honor Che's memory. Visitors came from every continent to see the place where the famous revolutionary was finally laid to rest. Many of them were young people who had been inspired by his story to become involved in fighting for social justice in their own countries. But Che's transformation into a global icon also created some problems that would have troubled him deeply if he had lived to see them. His image began to appear on commercial products that had nothing to do with revolution or social justice. Companies used his picture to sell beer, watches, motorcycles, and even luxury goods for wealthy people. This commercialization of Che's image was ironic, because he had spent his life arguing that people should not be motivated by money or material possessions. He had believed that human beings could learn to work for moral reasons rather than for personal profit. Seeing his face used to sell expensive products to rich consumers would have made him angry and sad. The commercial use of Che's image also meant that many people knew what he looked like without knowing anything about what he had actually believed or done. His face became a symbol of rebellion and nonconformity that could be worn by anyone who wanted to look cool or rebellious, regardless of whether they cared about the political ideas he had died for. Despite this commercialization, Che's real legacy continued to influence people who were seriously committed to fighting injustice. His writings were still studied by activists and revolutionaries who wanted to understand how to organize effective resistance movements. His example of total commitment to his principles continued to inspire people who believed that the world needed to be changed. Che's influence on popular culture went far beyond politics. Musicians wrote songs about him, filmmakers made movies about his life, and writers created novels inspired by his story. His motorcycle journey through South America became the subject of books and films that introduced his story to new generations of young people. More than 50 years after his death, Che Guevara remains a figure who creates strong emotions in people around the world. His supporters see him as a hero who sacrificed everything to fight for the poor and oppressed. His critics view him as a dangerous fanatic who promoted violence and dictatorship. Very few people are neutral about Che Guevara. This continuing controversy is probably exactly what Che would have wanted. He had never tried to be popular with everyone. He had always believed that anyone who was seriously fighting for justice would make enemies among the people who benefited from injustice. He would rather be hated by the wrong people than loved by everyone. Today, in a world that still has enormous inequality between rich and poor countries, Che's basic message remains relevant. He argued that human beings have a moral duty to help each other, and that sometimes this duty requires great personal sacrifice. He believed that people who live comfortable lives while others suffer are not really living fully human lives. Whether people agree with his methods or not, most would admit that Che Guevara lived according to his principles. He gave up wealth, comfort, and safety to fight for what he believed was right. He never compromised his ideals for personal advantage, and he was willing to die rather than abandon his commitment to helping oppressed people. The transformation of Ernesto Guevara from a comfortable Argentine medical student into Che Guevara, the eternal symbol of revolution, shows the power that one person can have when they are willing to dedicate their entire life to fighting for their beliefs. His story continues to challenge people to ask themselves what they are willing to sacrifice for the things they claim to believe in. In the end, Che's greatest achievement may not have been any particular revolution he helped to win or lose. Instead, it may have been the example he set of what it means to live a life of complete commitment to making the world a better place for everyone.